Hello and welcome to HLA Live. This is the 8th episode of HLA Live, which is our weekly program broadcast live on the HLA YouTube channel. Each week we talk to interesting people from the HLA community and beyond about the issues and topics that our community have expressed an interest in. The HLA has 6 pillars of leadership that we deliver through our programs. The pillars are: the leader as a communicator, the leader as a manager, the leader as a negotiator, the leader as an innovator and entrepreneur, the leader as a follower, and the leader as a philosopher. Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these pillars. This week, we're talking about Brits in America, practicing medicine in the USA, joined by an honorary Brit in the form of Krista. This week's topic was the result of the interests of HLA scholars, particularly Pedra, who is hosting. Pedra's put together tonight's episode of HLA Live with Eamon, Tim, Alistair and Riddy and the rest of the HLA Live team, and brought together a fabulous panel of speakers. Chairing tonight's panel will be Pedra, so handing over to Pedra.
Hello, everyone. So most of you know me. If you haven't, I'm Pedra. So the reason why we're doing this session is that many of you, such as I, have wondered about working abroad, like in the USA, Australia, or even Singapore. So this session, we want to inform you what it's like to work in the USA as a doctor. So our first speaker today is Dr. Kim Turner. Dr. Kim Turner is graduated from St. George's Hospital. She ended up doing her master's in global health at the University of South California and decided to move to Los Angeles. She's currently working as a TV medical advisor on many different TV shows, such as Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, Station 19, and Little Fires Everywhere. She's also currently doing a multi-center study looking at the impact of COVID-19 on pregnant women and their babies. For more information, you can check out the information down below at a YouTube video. Our second speaker is Dr. David Coggin-Carr. He's currently working as a maternal fetal medicine fellow in the USA. And that's him right there. Wonderful. And next we have Dr. Hussein, who's a core surgical trainee in Oxford. Dr. Hussein is our only doctor on this panel who's actually in the UK, but he did his elective at Johns Hopkins about 2 years ago. Our next speaker is Prashant Rao, who actually graduated at the same university I'm currently attending, King's College London. And he's currently doing his fellowship in cardiology at the Beth Israel Medical Center, which is associated with the Harvard Medical School. Our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Krista Mayost. I do apologize for pronouncing your last name incorrectly. And Krista is a former neurosurgeon who is currently based in Norway right now, but he spent the past year as a fellow at Harvard University. So this is our panel right here. And the first question I have for everyone is, why did they go to the USA? So I think, Kim, you want to jump in onto this, if I'm correct?
Yes. So if someone had told me 10 years ago I'd be living in Los Angeles in 2020, well, many things about 2020, if people had told me, I wouldn't have believed them. But actually, me living in Los Angeles was definitely not one of them. I did specialty training in North West Thames. I worked with Johan, trained with Johan. And in 2015, I needed a break. And I have family in Los Angeles, so I came to the University of Southern California and I studied for a master's in global health. My family all loved it here and they decided to stay. And so it wasn't really a particular plan. I didn't, write this as a goal. It was just something that happened organically. When we left, I said, no, I'll definitely be back. I'll still have my training number, all of that. But we stayed. I was offered a job teaching at the University of Southern California, which I really enjoy. I don't practice here, which I really miss, but I do have this sideline in medical advising on TV, which is quite fun. But I have to confess, I enjoy the teaching probably far more.
Thank you, Kim. And I was wondering, David, I believe you came a couple of years ago. And do you want to tell us a bit more about why you moved exactly to the US?
Sure. So I came 4 years ago now, actually, and I was 12 years out from med school and having trained initially in obstetrics gynecology and gone into MFM subspecialty training in London. For me, it was a bit of push and pull. So I had done the USMLE actually about 12 years ago now in 2009, which was about, I suppose, 4 years out from medical school. And the reason then is I got a little bit disillusioned with the UK system at that time. It was around the MTAS debacle that probably many people remember. So a lot of people were unhappy with UK training. And so I, at that point, discovered California and really fell in love with it and really tried to make it happen for me to make the move at that point in my career. And then for many reasons, that really wasn't feasible. And I put it aside then for a number of years. And only really when we hit another sort of government stumbling block around the industrial action in 2015, I felt that that my sort of future in the UK health system felt very insecure, and I didn't like the lack of flexibility that we have as doctors in the UK with very few employment options. And so I re-explored the idea, ended up deciding to make the jump, and I actually held on to my training number for a year. I did similar to what Kim did an OOP. It was an OOP-C for experience, clinical clinical experience, and so that I had the pathway to come back if I didn't like US practice, but actually I totally fell in love with it, and so made the move to stay, and gave up my training number after a year of being here. So for me, a lot of it was triggered by that push from the UK, but I'd also always had the draw to the US for practice as well. And so this was the natural place to come rather than going to Canada or New Zealand or one of the places that more people tend to go to if they're UK trained. And I was ST7 when I left, so I was within, literally a few months of consultant posts.
Wow, that sounds tough to make that decision. And so hey, you came for your elective about 2 years ago and you decided to go back. Did you ever look into going back to the US, or do you prefer it back in the UK?
So my reasons for staying in the UK are primarily family-based. At this stage in my life, it's just more convenient to be in the UK. But I haven't completely excluded the idea of going to the US for instance, a fellowship. But for personal reasons, I've chosen to stay back and pursue surgical training here.
I see. And so one of the conversations that came up before everyone came onto the Zoom right now was the visas conversation. So Prashant, you discussed that your situation was a bit different to everyone else. Do you want to tell me a bit more about why that's the case?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are many trainees that come to the States come on something called a J visa. But the J visa itself has some kind of restrictions to it, particularly after training. It kind of requires 2 years either back in kind of the home country or 2 years in an underserved area of the States, which can put a bit of a halt to getting good jobs and further career progression. Whereas me, for example, came on an H1B visa, and I think David was mentioning he came on a similar type of visa, which allows for a more kind of streamlined transition towards a green card after training. And so it's certainly just something to keep in mind for people wanting to pursue training in the States.
Does someone want to jump in on there to add anything onto it? I think that's Kim. Kim, you want to say something?
No, it was just really, it's really a good idea to have a way back. Living in a country is really difficult. In a new country is really difficult and really challenging wherever you go. So I think what all of us have said is don't burn if you're going to leave the UK, don't burn your boats. I held on to my training number for 3 years, and I only gave up my medical license quite recently because I had to, because I couldn't do the reevaluation. So always, come see what you think, but living in a new country is very tough. They don't understand our accents here too, which sometimes is tricky. So, so always have a way back if you can.
There's some good advice there, because that was something I had a fear if I was going to go abroad and work abroad, because obviously you want to have a home base in case you do have to come back to UK. So Prashant, you wanted to add something else to it?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge. I totally agree with Kim in saying don't burn your bridges, because I can't imagine anybody's path from the UK or from elsewhere to the States is going to be one of a smooth transition and a linear progression. There are going to be setbacks for sure, and I know for myself, I've spent kind of many sleepless nights wondering about the visa situation, and it has been quite challenging and nerve-wracking at times. And so, so certainly I agree with what Kim says from my own personal experience as well, is that you really don't want to be burning any bridges.
And David, do you want to come in as well?
I just wanted to just echo the same thing, that one, it's difficult, and two, it's important to have a pathway back. And even though I left at ST7, I actually worked really hard to make sure that I was able to get my CCT in the UK. That was really challenging, trying to get all the workplace-based assessments done and all the hoops that we have to jump through abroad in a non-recognized center. But I did actually get my final year accredited as out of program training, and accredited 1 year of my US residency. So I'm on the specialist register now in the UK. And that was really important for me because I don't know what the future holds. And if I wanted to transition back, I did want a pathway. So just for full disclosure, I wanted to put that out there.
That's great to hear. And you talked about how the system in the UK was inflexible. And so I personally thought the US system was more inflexible compared to the UK. Do you want to give me a bit more about that, David?
Well, I was really talking more about employment rather than training. So I think that there are pros and cons to that. So for example, the US residency match system is really mind-boggling. I was lucky enough not to have to go through it. And I'm happy to be contacted for advice around, ways to avoid it. But for the majority of people, they will go through the match training, and you end up having to spread your net or cast your net wide in order to be able to give yourself a good chance of getting a training post. So it's a lot of interviewing in a lot of different places. So from that point of view, getting into a training program in the UK is much easier, and it's much more flexible during training, that you can take time out for maternity, paternity, different out of program experiences. None of that really works well on the US side. But ultimately, when you finish residency after a few brutal years, there are so many more job opportunities in terms of the type of setting you could work in. You can work in public healthcare, private healthcare, a non-profit like I work for, academic practice, the VA. There's a whole list of different environments that, so that if you weren't happy with your employment sort of circumstances, whether that be salary, working conditions, call schedule, you can negotiate that and make lateral movements. Whereas that's obviously not true in the NHS, where there's a single unified contract for physicians across the country.
Of course. And Krista, do you want to add something towards David's last point?
Well, a lot of my colleagues here has been saying about practicing. For me, myself, I went to the US with, I've always been on a fellowship, which is possible. You have I did a Harkness fellowship, which is a health policy fellowship basically, and I was not able to practice since I didn't have the US MLE. It's the J1 visa, the similar one, and I met a lot of other fellows. Some had Fulbright scholarships, some were from the UK. There are also possibilities for you if you don't have the US MLE or you don't want to practice, but you want to study, you want to work on your PhD and so on. There are several labs all over the US tied to different departments. One lab I went to in the neurosurgery department at the Brigham had several students from the Netherlands who had funding from Netherlands. They had a contact with the University of Leiden, and the University of Leiden paid for them, and they could stay, and they can also follow and work in, or not work in the clinic, but at least oversee patient treatment and so on. So if you want to go to the US, you don't need the US MLE. You don't have to start there. You can also go there and do research, it's just great. They have so much resources, and it's a lot of opportunities. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's just one of the things when it comes to the US, is that I've just been hearing there's so much opportunities there in terms of studying, work-wise, and even family planning as well. So one thing that I'm really really want some clarification is the difference between the UK and the US-based system working in it. What were the different things you had to get used to coming from a UK-based background? So Shahib, because you recently just, I think you're the one who just recently moved there, not moved there, but been there, been through the transition and coming back. What was the biggest surprise you faced?
Well, I did a sub-internship in surgery, specifically with the HPB department at Johns Hopkins. And the culture there is very different. And I think that's true across all the surgical specialties in the US. So for instance, I would routinely wake up at 4:30 in the morning, pre-round my patients at 5, present those cases. And at Hopkins, there was teaching every day, whether it's sort of didactic teaching or an M&M setting, etc. Following which you'd be in theatre for several hours. And you'd basically work from about 4:30 in the morning until sometimes 6, 7 p.m. And you'd have 2 ward rounds, one in the morning, one in the evening. And those were some of the key differences compared to UK practice. As a medical student, I also felt that what was expected of you was higher than in the UK. I was expected to scrub in, I was expected to assist, and expected to read up on the operations, understand the indications, etc., which is a different culture to the UK from my personal experience. It was intense, but I learned a lot in that 1 month that I spent there.
I think I do have to agree with you, because that's what I hear from quite a lot of people. And it does sound quite intense. So how did people deal with that, deal with the intensity of the situation? Was it worth going through that system than having a bit more of a, free time in between? So I'm going to shine a light onto David to take this away.
So I agree with that entirely, that it's extremely intense. And for me, it felt like doing the same number of hours in a 4-year residency as I would do in a 7-year program in the UK, because there isn't much work-life balance. You are in, when I was in New York, I was in even earlier, maybe 4 a.m. on a daily basis. Now things are a little bit more balanced. But the point is that it's intense, but it's an intense educational experience. And so there's a lot of didactic stuff, as Trav was alluding to. And also it's a lot more intense surgical training. So again, being in a surgical specialty in obstetrics and gynecology, in the US training program, when you're rotating through gynecology, you're in theatre all day, every day. So there is a much greater expectation regarding the number of cases that you do in order to qualify in residency. So for example, you have to do a minimum of 85 hysterectomies. In the UK, the number is 0. So that's a huge difference. That's partly because the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology have dumbed down the training program to some degree and put it out into sort of subspecialty areas, so that not every consultant needs to be practicing all areas of all aspects of the specialty. But I didn't have anywhere near an emphasis on service provision as I had in my UK training, where a lot of the time we would be, doing consultations in A&E and dealing with patients on the wards. The expectation is you come in, you round on your patients, and you get that stuff done in the early hours, so that you're then available for 12 hours a day to just operate, or just do ultrasounds, or just do clinic and see specialist patients. So from that point of view, it's a very intense but very rich educational environment. And so for me, I found, especially coming into it later, that was a really valuable thing to go through, because I was already comfortable with the specialty and I just got huge volume training and became surgically much more competent than I would have been staying in the British system of just doing surgeries every now and again, and being maybe in theatre once or twice a fortnight.
And how does anyone find the differences in terms of interventions? For example, technology is something that we talk about in UK, that we use the most cost-effective initiatives, whereas in the US it's more of a private health sector where they tend to use I'm not sure, but please do correct me, but do they tend to use the most expensive services to provide to the patients? So what is it like when it comes to actually treating the patient? Do you always use the most cost-effective approach, or does the hospital tend to choose the best approach to the patient? So Krista, do you want to take this away?
Yeah, you know, I haven't been practicing, so I guess the doctors here that have been, like David, let's comment on that. But I can basically, an important thing for those who don't know is that the US is almost using 20% of their GMP on healthcare. It's almost a half in the UK and Norway, around 10%. So it's they spend a lot of money, and I think one of the reasons they spend a lot of money is the multi-payer system, meaning that you have insurers that have an insurer between the patient and the physician, and what you see, you have no price transparency in the US. Big hospitals can charge basically what they want for a procedure, and the big hospitals do, especially the ones that are well known, like Massachusetts General in Boston, and it could be like up to 4 or 5 times more than a small hospital outside in New Hampshire, and the insurance companies pay for it. And what they do, they increase the premiums for the patients that pays the premiums, and in the end, the patients pays for it in a way. But this system drives up the payments, and there's several studies on this, and there are economical incentives for the doctors to actually use the most expensive treatment. Obviously, this is not the rule, but it seems that there's a famous, there's several papers, and some of them are saying basically that the Americans are using they're using more of the more advanced treatments, and they're also using more treatments for several procedures or diseases, and I think this can be pointed to the way the whole multi-payer system is set up. I mean, David, you have probably some experience with this. Some of my colleagues call this grotesque incentives compared to the UK. I don't know if you agree, but maybe you can comment on the way it is different.
Sure. So I definitely have heard this. I agree totally that the multi-payer system adds a degree of complexity, and it's sort of the other end of a spectrum to sole universal healthcare, and things get stupidly expensive. And it's, you know, very interesting to look at the explanation of benefits you get when you're dealing with your own healthcare and see how much was billed for different things and how much was actually paid. What I would reassure people about is that I haven't, at least in my subspecialty area and specialty area across 4 years and 2 or 3 institutions, I haven't seen any evidence of that. And so in my first year, I worked between a pure public healthcare provider, Bellevue Hospital, which is the oldest public hospital in the US, and that is really like every bit like the NHS, but more extreme, because it really specializes in providing care to disadvantaged people, uninsured people. The other side in New York was more of a private system, but still, I say private, I think we have to be careful with the use of that word, because most hospitals in the US are not private money-making organizations as a whole. Only about 1 in 6 are. The remainder are non-profits or public healthcare. And with a non-profit, which is, for example, where I work now, and where I worked in the non-public system in New York, really they deal with a whole range of different patients who might be self-paying, insurance covered, Medicaid, Medicare, all different sources, but they ultimately aren't allowed to profit from healthcare. So if they make an excess in a particular policy year, they have to donate that money out. And so in Vermont, we're always making excess, and we then donate that money back to charity and choose to some degree who gets that each year. On the floor, I've never seen any sort of impact of finance on clinical decision making. And if anything, I found it much more academic, much more evidence-based here, substantially so, particularly in obstetrics, where we have a lower C-section rate here than we do in the UK, and really no sort of incentives, perverse financial incentives that I've come across. And I think a lot of people worry about that on a day-to-day basis. It's you're somehow going to have to making decisions or checking people's credit card details. And the reality is, going about your day-to-day work as a doctor, you never know what insurance your patient has. Yes, it will be billed differently after the fact, but ultimately that doesn't affect the practice of medicine, at least in many areas. And in addition, I've lost my train of thought, but I was going to say that it doesn't, if you're in an area like mine, like obstetrics, actually all patients in the United States are eligible for pregnancy care through Medicaid, even if they're uninsured. So I don't particularly in my field have any issue around insurance coverage anyway. And there's also the law EMTALA, which some people might be familiar with, which means that all US healthcare institutions have to provide emergency care free at the point of use. And so there is none of this sort of stereotype of, being turned away by an ambulance because you're not insured or you don't have a credit card. That's simply not true. There are more access problems, sort of like primary care or outpatient based things, but any emergency care is provided, even if the hospital never gets reimbursed for that. And I found that reassuring in my time here.
That's really interesting to hear, because I don't really hear much about evidence-based practice, not evidence-based, more about evidence-based cost-effective practice. Sorry about that. So yeah, I don't hear about much evidence-based cost-effective practice in the US. I've just been seeing a lot of shiny lights and a lot of glamorous TV shows. I think Kim can add something towards that, actually. Kim, I think your mic's on mute.
So the stuff we do on the TV shows is all bright and shiny, but we mainly do that because it is interesting and it is fun and it is different. So whenever we have a medical storyline on a TV show, we consult with people who are actually working in that specialty, and we try and get the most up to date. A lot of the medical storylines we use are also based on real cases. So shows like Grey's Anatomy have full-time medical researchers who pick up cases, and then they also have doctors. And I know The Resident, I don't know if you've seen that show, The Resident also has doctors working on their writing staff. You can, in fact, if you're a US doctor, you can apply to be on the writing staff of some of those shows. They have like small fellowships where you can come and spend a few months to be on the writing staff and to make it as accurate as possible. But the thing is, television, you want it to be a good story and you want it to be interesting and you want it to be different. So showing, someone just doing an appendectomy, open surgically is not that interesting, but if you can do it endoscopically, then that's going to be more fun. So we always do go for the big shiny things just so people are more interested in them, but we do try and make it accurate. But everyone who works in medicine knows that there are definitely big differences in what you see on TV and what is in real life.
I do believe you're making a very interesting point. And Prashant, do you want to talk about your experience? Because you're working at one of Harvard's teaching hospitals, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so I did my F1 and F2 in the Oxford Deanery before moving over to the States for internal medicine residency, and now in Boston for cardiology fellowship. I think, David very eloquently kind of summed up his experience, which has been pretty similar to mine. But the only point I would add is that you'd probably get quite a heterogeneous kind of experience across the different kind of hospitals and institutions across the States. whether it's a academic center like David and myself work in versus a community hospital, etc., and the VA, etc. So that's probably something to take into account as well. And that might be the fact that we work in academic centers might be the case why we see this kind of evidence-based practice being implemented.
I believe Krista has his hand. So Krista, do you want to shine some public health onto this again? Because that would be great to hear your perspective.
No, yes, I would just say, just a comment to David, that being a patient in the US, at least in the primary, in the acute hospital, I had my son there. He had a little wound in the forehead, and they took his blood pressure. They listened to his heart. We spent 6 to 7 hours there because they wanted to stitch up. They only needed one stitch in that scar, and I would say that there are some incentives in the system in the US that makes people overtreat a little bit more than you would expect them to do in the NHS and in the Norwegian healthcare system. And like I said, research shows that, and they're spending way too much money on healthcare, and that's one of the sort of the worries about the US. At the same time, I would say I just did the research study on the innovation degree in the US, and I find like what we've been looking at is that the single payer system like Norway and the UK, it's much harder to be innovative or to start new projects, for instance, with artificial intelligence or similar IT projects, because everything needs to be approved on a regional level or a hospital level. While in the US, you have much more self-contracting physicians, for instance, that can start a project on artificial intelligence without asking for a permit, which makes a lot of the healthcare, I think it makes it's very dynamic. There's a lot of innovation. And again, that's what makes it fun to be there, because there's a lot of things happening. Like everyone wants to do something. And I think, the European sort of attitude is more being, a little bit more obedient to the system, I guess. Yeah, my impression at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think Europe is just trying to go for the initiative of health for all, whereas right now in the US, I believe they're just trying to figure out what to do next. So, David, I believe you want to just, I think you want to come in, and that would be our last speaker for this question. David?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to circle back from what Prashant and Krista both said, is that I totally agree with that you can have a sort of a biased view from, in terms of where you look. And I'm very conscious that there is heterogeneity across the United States. And I talk about that all the time. So I just wanted to, make sure that people are aware of that. And it does come down to some degree, I suppose, but how much of it is about your, what you do on an individual basis. And then because working on a day-to-day basis in the US, choosing to work where I do, obviously I'm very satisfied in the evidence-based practice and non-financially driven practice that myself and my colleagues promote. But yeah, I am aware that in other places around there will be different standards applied, and that's hard, especially when you come from an NHS background where there's a great homogeneity of standards across the whole system that we don't have here. And I work with a 4-hour catchment radius for complex obstetrics, and some of the stuff that goes on in the small hospitals would really turn your stomach a lot of the time. But again, it comes down to, I think, how you rationalize that and the wider political sort of arguments around that against day-to-day medical practice, which for here is certainly, if you choose to work in the places where you're going to be happiest, is quite consistent with the NHS. And anyone who's thinking about coming here, definitely recommend targeting the academic programs, purely because it'll be more similar to what you're used to coming from a UK background.
So coming in to talk about more about training, because David, I'm just leading on from your last point. So the US is known to have one of the best training programs across the world. I mean, if you pick up any article and be like, which country has the best training program, US will be one of the top ones. So how do you compare it to the NHS? Because you guys worked in the NHS, you studied within the NHS, but then you came to this program. Do you wish that it was, what aspects do you love about it, and do you think it's one of the best ones in the world? So who wants to take this in? Who wants to take this first? Prashant, do you want to go for it?
Thanks for allowing me to speak on this first. So I think the training system in the US and the UK are just quite different training programs, and the emphasis, I can speak for internal medicine because that's the residency that I did here. There's probably a difference in emphasis on kind of clinical examination, for example, and clinical skills, and that's probably reflected in the MRCP PACES exam, which I took before coming to the States, compared to the American Board of Internal Medicine exams, where quite clearly there's a much greater emphasis on clinical skills actually in England. That said, some of the training structure in America is something that I've been particularly impressed with. And during residency and fellowship, like Shahab had alluded to earlier, is that we have didactic sessions almost every day, if not kind of twice a day, and there's very much it's driven towards the trainees learning rather than being purely service provision. But like I said, I do have to say that having a slightly skewed opinion, experience, it being in the States, being in an academic center as well. So there are definitely differences in training styles and training culture. I wouldn't want to say one is better than the other, but I've been happy with my experience here, certainly over the past 5 years, and so, but it might not be for everyone, and I think that's important to note as well.
I think you do raise a good point that not everyone's suited for one particular system. Is what I always tell myself, for example, A-level versus IB, for example. So Shahab, do you want to reflect a bit more about what you thought about the program? Do you think it compares, do you think the UK compare anywhere close to the US? Do you have any issues regarding the technical language as well?
So, I mean, I would just echo what Prashant said, with the caveat that I was at a very academic center in a very subspecialized division of general surgery, HPB. In terms of technical language, I don't think there were, any significant differences. The concepts are the same in medicine, but generally key things to point out is just the tremendous emphasis on didactic teaching. On a lot of the residents were doing additional stuff, so MPH, PhDs, which was all baked into the residency program at Johns Hopkins. One of the key differences is that in the NHS, training is generic across the country. You have set outcomes, and there isn't variation from other centers. However, I think there is a degree of heterogeneity within the UK. So for instance, surgical training in Oxford would be different to surgical training in the east of England, even though the objectives are the same. And of course, in the UK, there is a greater emphasis on service provision, and that's to do with the fact that the NHS is a public system. With respect to the US, the hours are certainly more intense. Over here, you would do typically a 12 to 14 hour on call. Whereas in the US, my resident would be on call for about 36 hours. would start at 5 a.m. and leave at 10 a.m. the next morning, for instance. So it is certainly a lot more intense, but as a consequence, the training is shorter, and you get a lot of experience in that 5-year program.
I mean, it does sound quite a lot intense. 36 hours is quite a lot of time. And so do you find these environments to be much more competitive than the UK environment? Because in UK, we find that a lot of medical students compete with each other to get their publications in for those small AFP points, for example. So is it like that in the US? Prashant, do you want to take, you have your hand up.
So just to, I will answer that competitive point in a minute, but just to follow on from the previous question, from what Shay was saying, you mentioned the idea that, you know, there's the idea that we have more kind of elective time that's baked into our training system in the US. And for me, that's been particularly important because these are the kinds of times that you spend really pursuing what you're interested in, which end up becoming incredibly important for your future career progression. And so I'm, you know, it's been, like I said, it's been 5 years since I've been in the NHS system, but I think in the 2 years I was there, I didn't really have as much elective time as I've experienced here. So that's the first thing to say. In terms of the competitiveness, you know, I think gaining kind of cardiology fellowship here is cardiology being one of the more competitive subspecialties in the you know, in internal medicine. Generally, the competition ratios are, I think, in the year I applied, is that you have around 1,200 or something like that applicants in the year, and each training program has around somewhere between 6 to 10 on average training spots. But like David had mentioned before, you know, you can apply to as many programs as you like. And you end up kind of interviewing in multiple places rather than, you know, for core medical training, or you'll have that one interview and get that score from that. So it's a really different kind of application process. I don't know if it's any more competitive or less competitive, but that's kind of how it is in the States, or how it's been for cardiology fellowship here.
So leading on to that, do you find as an international medical graduate going to the US that you found it more difficult, or you didn't have that advantage, you didn't have that benefit like you would have had in the UK to get onto the right residency program or fellowship program? David, do you want to take this one, because you came from an ST7 background to the US?
Yes, that was challenging to come from essentially a senior registrar kind of call, where I was third on call and really, you know, sleeping all night and just coming in for difficult surgeries. To go from that to being an intern in the US system was really quite challenging. And that first year was a real brutal wake up call and an adjustment period for me. But I survived it and enjoyed it and learned a lot out of it. I would say that one of the things that came up a little bit from Shoaib's experience is how intense medical school here is, to the point that there's no such thing as a foundation program. You're going straight into specialty at the end of your 4-year med school program, and you really are applying then a year before that, so towards the end of 3rd year, beginning of 4th year. So in order to make your CV competitive for a specialty, particularly if it's surgical, something that's hard to get into, you really have to start in the 2nd year of medical school, you know, in your 2nd preclinical year, trying to get stuff together. And there's also a really intense kind of pre-rounding culture, and very comprehensive daily rounding notes that are systems based, that just don't really happen so much in the UK system. So I felt very much at a loss for not having been through US medical school. And it was really hard. I came in and people said, oh God, you write notes like an attending, because I would just write brief like summaries like we would write on paper, and they were looking for something entirely different. So it took a while to sort of be sort of molded into what a US resident actually looks like and does. In terms of competitiveness, it's definitely it's very specialty dependent and center dependent. And then in terms of like the quality of training, at least for my specialty, gynecology is far stronger here because of what I already said about surgical volume. The expectations of surgery and your actual exposure to surgery is infinitely higher here. However, on the obstetric side, because obstetricians in the US deliver babies normally as well as by C-section and forceps and vacuum, you end up diluting your training down by doing a lot of midwifery. So in my view, the obstetrics is a little weaker here, but it balances out. And the final thing I'd say about training is that the big difference here is you're doing your entire training in one institution. So that can be a positive and a negative. On one sense, you get well known, you get accustomed, and you can achieve a lot more in 4 years in one place than rotating around. But on the flip side, it introduces heterogeneity, like we've been talking about in many domains of healthcare here. So you can have a very good experience or a bad experience, and you don't get the ability to rotate through different places and see how people do things differently. And I think that is actually a limitation, because people become the product of their program, which makes it a little bit harder when you move around.
So, out of curiosity, did any of you get any help to move to the US? Did anyone give you any advice on what you should do, or etc.? Or did you have to do all the research yourself? Was there anyone you can go to? So, who were your points of contacts, not just to study, not just go and train in the US, but also for your electives or for your masters, etc.? Did anyone have any points of contacts? So, Kim, go for it.
No, actually, and I found, I don't know if everyone else found this, but I found it actually quite difficult to find information. So actually applying to university for the masters wasn't that difficult, but then actually looking into the whole international medical graduate process, the website's not easy. It's quite, I mean, I'm going to talk you through it in just a minute, but no, it was quite hard to find advice from people on what to do. I think if I had any advice, and perhaps this is the advice that everyone would give, is that I wish I'd done USMLE when I was doing medical school finals, just as a sort of added on. I wish I'd done it, and then it would be out of the way. I know some people who've done that, but there are very few websites that actually sort of talk you through the whole process, and it is difficult, and it's also different from state to state.
I didn't even know that was an aspect, the difference between state to state. I just thought everything will be similar throughout the entire country. I mean, I think that's the case how it is here. So I believe, David, do you want to add anything onto this?
I really didn't have any help, and I hadn't done any US like rotations. I had done an observership long time ago at UCSF, but really wasn't really clued up at that point. Didn't realize how important things like letters of recommendation are. And those were if I was doing this again, definitely I would try and make contact with people, because one of the things about recruitment in the US is that because people come into a program and stick there for so long, they really do care about who they recruit. They want to find people who are the right fits, you know, both personally, professionally, and it's very hard to gamble on an unknown quantity. That's why these letters of recommendation are so important. So trying to get clinical experience in the US, or at least have connections in some way, you know, I think is really useful. And obviously the process of navigating a general move of your life is also really challenging. I managed to get through that without too many problems, but it did require a lot of research, and often, you know, what you read in websites might not be that practical in real life. So, you know, if you just keep it simply, you'd say, oh, I'm going to do these exams, I'm going to apply to the match, and somehow I'll fall into place. But the reality is you have to apply strategically as an international medical graduate to make sure you don't get filtered out. So a lot of university programs will actually drop the IMGs out of the application pool because they're often dealing with 1,000 applications for just 3 posts, something like that. So our program here, we have 3 residents a year. We got 700 applications for those 3 posts. And so we can't look at all 700 applications. We have to have an algorithm to filter that. And so it's being savvy about those kind of mechanisms, and to know how you are going to make your application seen, whether that's by knowing someone on the inside who can, you know, nudge the program director, or, you know, having a relationship with some of the places you're applying.
That's quite unfortunate to hear. I mean, I can't relate at all, but it's quite unfortunate. So Prashant, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think David actually summed up logistically the challenges of trying to secure a residency or fellowship spot in the US pretty well. And the filters are something that is quite commonplace among most programs, if not all competitive programs in the States. It is also just important to touch on, you know, besides from it being logistically challenging to transition to the States, you know, many of the audience, I understand, are kind of in final year medical school and starting foundation training, and actually kind of uprooting your home and leaving family, etc., to move to the States, like myself. That's probably been you know, the hardest part of making this transition beyond the actual USMLE step taking exams and interviews, etc. And so it's important for people to actually understand that aspect as well. People making the move to the States, it's generally going to be a long-term move, and leaving close family and friends is something which shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, I mean, transitioning the entire family to the US does seem like a big deal, trying to find jobs for your partner, as well as moving in with your kids, trying to find schools. I mean, Kim, I believe you went through the entire process yourself as well.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, the good thing is we're really lucky. You know, I'm originally from South Africa. When I moved from South Africa to England, all we had was those aerogram letters to communicate with our family. Now I talk to my parents every day on FaceTime, but the thing is, at the moment, I can't travel. So up until last year, I would probably be in England maybe 3 times a year and see my family, and I can't travel at all, which is really tricky. The other thing is, America has a very good PR company. It's called Hollywood. And when you look at America on TV, it looks fantastic, but there are lots of things that when you actually live here are quite challenging. If I just say the banking system, do all of the rest of you feel how I feel? I mean, yeah, we're all shaking our heads. So in America, they still write checks, bit of a shock, have a checkbook. You know, you can't do online banking, is very old, is very basic. All of the websites that we use are quite old and quite basic to use, you know, for the applications and stuff. Things like getting a social security number can be a little bit challenging. And you just have to, there is a degree of culture shock about it. You really have to get used to some of these things. And it took me quite a long time to get used to the banking system. It was very, very frustrating. And then there are other things that you miss, you know, like Marks and Spencer's and decent cup of tea. When I worked, I used to take in a mug and my PG tips and make my own tea when I was working on TV shows, because I missed so much having that cup of tea that we would get at work in England. So there are lots of big and little things, but it is, we think that we know America because we see it on TV and it's in our living rooms every day, but actually living here is actually quite different. And I totally agree with what the other two said, which is that the culture shock for your family can be quite huge. Oh, the education, I'm not even going to get started.
I mean, everyone's face just lit up when Kim talked about tea. I'm presuming the tea is not that great in the States, if I'm correct. Prashant, how's your tea?
I'll tell you what. So I didn't actually. I don't miss tea that much. I mean, I'm able to get tea here. Match of the day. That's what I really missed. Saturday evenings, I didn't have anything to watch, and you don't realize how much you miss the thing until they're actually gone. But sorry that there was no added additional educational content I was going to provide. It's just to say I was missing Match today.
I mean, I feel that's fair for you. I mean, I feel like a lot of people will miss the classic meal deals from Tesco. I don't know what else. Sunday roast. There's a lot of other stuff I can think of, but I'm kind of forgetting right now. So what were the most shocking hidden costs that you had to face? It doesn't have to be regarding training wise. It could be any hidden costs. Like, did you have hidden costs when you were signing your house, etc.? What were the biggest hidden costs you had to face? So David, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, two things immediately come to mind. One is brokering. So this is something, if you move to a city, like I'd never really heard what this is about, but when you try and find an apartment to rent somewhere like New York, where I landed, it is extremely difficult because you don't have a social security number until you have been like resident in the US for 2 to 3 weeks. And so you don't have a credit history. And so no one trusts you and they think that you're going to basically squat in their flat. And so it was incredibly difficult to find anyone who would entertain renting to a new immigrant. The second thing is that this brokering fee, so they basically charge you 15% of the annual rent, or usually 1 to 1.5 months rent as a sort of tip to the person who connects you with the landlord. And so that's very much specific to big cities. And I think it's particularly prevalent in New York, but that was a huge shock. They also asked me for a $20,000 security deposit in order to take the apartment that I was able to rent. And this was after being turned down for maybe 10 places once they knew that I was an immigrant. The second thing was like immigration costs. So it depends on the visa pathway, but I used an H-1B visa, which allowed me a pathway to a green card. The total cost of that green card in legal fees in the end was about $40,000 in application and legal fees. So again, huge outgoing. That said, it's been worth it for me because it's allowed me to take up a position that's permanent, and I don't have to worry about seeking places that would continue visa sponsorship, because the principle is if you're giving a job to a foreign national, you're supposed to be able to demonstrate that there isn't a suitably qualified American individual for that job. And that leads into what Prasant said earlier about needing to go to an area of need. You essentially have to work either in a geographic location that no one really wants to, or a work setting like a particular hospital that no one really wants to be in this able to satisfy the requirements for some of the visas. So for me, being an academic person with like an MD, PhD, I wanted to be in academic centers. So it was a worthwhile outlay for me, but it was kind of shocking that it cost that much.
Kim, do you have anything else to add to that?
I was going to say exactly the same. Visa costs, very, very expensive. I came in on a student visa. I then transitioned to an O visa, which is an alien of exceptional ability, and it was based on the work I do. I also have done work in the UK on medical advising, and then I transitioned into a green card. And yeah, the cost of that has, I would say, about the same. That has been the biggest thing. And also trying to establish yourself in the US and get a credit rating is very difficult, because in America they don't like people who don't have debts. They prefer you to have a debt, and they prefer to know that you pay it off regularly. But then you start off with a car loan, I think is the best, and then build up from it. So if you're going to stay here permanently and you want to get a mortgage, it can take you quite a long time to actually build up a credit rating and be someone who a mortgage company will take a risk on.
Quite interesting. I didn't even think of these little aspects. And Shahab, did you find any hidden costs when you were doing your elective in the States? Did you face anything yourself?
No, I mean, I was lucky. The elective was a program between Johns Hopkins and King's. So King's, I got a bursary for the elective. To be entirely honest, it was just like, for me, it was just a long one month trip. We got an Airbnb. There were 10 of us who were on this program. So yes, I mean, I can't really comment on what it's like to actually settle in the US. So I'm sorry for that.
No, it's all right. I mean, that's good to know on an elective perspective, that if someone goes for elective, let's say medicine or even someone else, that there's no hidden costs when you end up going there. Because myself, I was looking for next year to go to Johns Hopkins, but unfortunately that program's not happening anymore because of COVID. No surprise. Prashant, did you?
Well, you're going to say because of Shahab.
Yeah, definitely. Shahab ruined the entire experience for me. Actually, Shahab actually gave me some good pointers when I was applying for it, but unfortunately it did not happen because of COVID. So, Prashant, do you have any hidden costs yourself?
I think I don't have much to add from what the others have said, really. For me, the green card application, etc., was expensive and akin to David. So yeah, don't have much to add here.
So, out of curiosity, did many of you knew that you were becoming a US citizen when you were first moving to the US, or was this something that came about when you end up moving there? David, do you want to answer this question?
Yeah, I had no strong intentions when I first came in. I was coming in with the H-1B visa, which would have given me the ability to work under that visa for up to 7 years without intention to transition to something else like an O1, which is what I think both Prashant and Kim did. I did the direct to green card based on this extraordinary ability legal term, which is pretty hard to prove. You have to sort of meet certain legal criteria that they push back on. The reason I transitioned to green card and that was largely to improve my options applying to jobs after training. And then I am planning to sit my citizenship test in a couple of years. And the reason for that is one of the downsides to a green card is it only stays in play as long as you stay in the United States. If you leave the country for any longer than 6 months, you have to prove ties. If you're out for longer than a year, they won't let you back in through immigration unless you have a special exemption that can push you out to 2 years. So it's not very flexible for like moving around the world or living in other places. And one of the rights of citizenship, other than being able to vote here, which would be useful given what's going on, the additional benefit is that you can actually reside in any country you want and come freely back and forth to the United States. And so for me, that's worthwhile in the longer term.
I mean, can we talk about Trump? Is anyone willing to talk about the whole entire healthcare system, Trump, visas, etc.? Krista, do you want to jump in, or is Krista?
Well, I can do.
Kim, go for it.
So yeah, I mean, it's the last few years have been very interesting. I do remember very clearly on the night in 2016 when he won, and I remember clearly thinking, okay, it's 4 years, so what's the worst that could happen? And I think we're living it right now. So yeah, and it's not been easy, and I think it's not easy for everyone here. I mean, you know, I can't talk for everyone's politics. Everyone supports different people, but for me personally, there definitely has been a change in the US. I live in Los Angeles, I live in Venice, and it's a very left-wing sort of enclave. Everyone here will either vote Democrat or vote Green. Nobody here votes for Republicans. But still, you see the problems all around you. At the moment in California, we've got over 600,000 positive people who've tested positive for SARS-CoV-2. The health system here is under quite a strain. It's not been easy, and I worry about what will happen in November, and I worry about how long I want to stay. You know, I come from a very integrated mixed race family. My nieces and nephews are of color. They walk these streets. I worry about them going out. I worry about my friends going out. So, you know, I would never say don't come and live in America. I think living in another country, where whatever you do, even if you only do it for a year, is a really fantastic experience, and you should always do it because it's challenging, it's difficult. But at the moment, there are lots of things about America that are very, very difficult and very, very challenging, and that I hope will change. But it's going to take a while.
I mean, I think the entire world hopes it will change for the better. So David, do you want to come in here?
I just wanted to bring a little bit of light into this because it's easy. I'm sure we can get into a very deep, depressed hole talking about Trump and the new normal. But what I would say is that another thing that's important is that when you're talking about immigrating to the States, it is a sort of a combination of living in a country and living in a state. And so there can be quite different political agendas depending on where you choose to be. I'm in Vermont, which is obviously extremely progressive. It's Bernie Sanders' state, was the first state to legalize LGBTQ marriage back in the 90s. And so in response to Trump, we have had huge amounts of advocacy locally to try and enshrine rights to our patients. And so since he came into power, we've put forward a constitutional amendment to the state constitution to protect abortion rights so that it becomes independent of the federal position. So if Roe versus Wade gets overturned and the Trump administration tried to limit abortion, that would not apply in this state, because we have actually changed our constitution to state specifically that women have the right to choice and to having an abortion. That's just one example. And we also modified our state Medicaid to ensure that birth control, including IUDs, was covered permanently for all women, regardless of what future federal governments come into place. So there are ways in which a threat to our healthcare on a more national level can actually lead to meaningful change at the state level. If I was in somewhere that was much more red, I'd probably be more depressed than I am right now. So maybe that's a positive spin for you all.
No, I think that's a positive spin for sure. Okay, so moving forward, I have one of my final questions is towards all of you guys. If you could tell yourselves, if you can give yourself some advice before taking this journey, what would be that advice? So who wants to start? Kim?
I would take, I mean, I've already said it, I would take USMLE earlier. It just gives you more options. Admittedly, I have quite a nice niche career doing teaching and doing the medical TV work, but I do miss my clinical work, and I still have the textbooks. I still think I might take it, so I would take it when you can, often and early.
I mean, I really do hope you can take it soon. I'm not sure when test centers will open, but I'm hoping soon, or maybe in the next couple of months. Give you some time to study. Shoaib, would you give yourself some advice? What advice would you do if you were going to take an elective? What would you recommend for medical students to do beforehand?
So I think, well, first of all, understand the difference between something like a sub-internship and a clerkship and an observership. So sub-internships allow you to actually take part in clinical activity, which is what I did. Not all American universities will allow that for foreign medical students. So if you're interested and your university doesn't have a formal affiliation, then read up on that and look where you can apply. I think some background on the US culture in your specialty is pretty vital. I mean, I was quite shocked when I was expected in at 4:30 in the morning. And I was told that on my first day. And just understand some of the nuances of the US system. So the units, for example, are different. For instance, LFTs are different, electrolytes are different in terms of the units that are used. So these little pointers can just prepare you a little bit better for actually getting involved with clinical practice. Maybe read up on US websites, just with respect to local guidelines, local terminology, etc. It's not too different from the UK, but it's just important to be aware of them. And I think if you're seriously considering a move to the States and you have the opportunity to get on a sub-internship or a clerkship, then yes, do your USMLE. That was the first question I was asked at Hopkins. What was my USMLE grade, which I hadn't done, and I got this impression that they were looking at this program as an extended interview for potential matching to residency. So it is an opportunity if you want to explore it. You can build a lot of connections during your elective, and if you want to revisit the US for residency, it's a great opportunity to meet some of the team. And as David was alluding to, you are based at that institution throughout residency. So if you've got the opportunity to meet the program director and the rest of the team, then make a good impression if you're considering moving there.
I mean, that's some pretty good advice there. I mean, take advantage of doing your elective there if you do plan on moving to the US. And just to correct everyone, the right side to drive a car is on the right, and it's not yards, it's meters, it's kilometers, it's not miles. So moving forward, Prashant, what advice would you give yourself?
I think Shoaib kind of mentioned it, but I'd probably have kind of 3 key messages to take away in terms of key bits of advice for people seriously considering moving to the States for medicine. The first is, like Shoaib did, get some experience. And it doesn't matter, I mean, it's certainly better to have a clerkship versus an observership, etc. But get some experience, whether it's a research fellowship, observership, clerkship, whatever it might be, because that is going to be a potential avenue to meet someone who could vouch for you moving forward, write you a good letter of recommendation. And I know for myself, I started off doing an observership for a month, but that led to an opportunity meeting the chief of cardiology, who had been incredibly influential in bringing me to the States, to first to Arizona, and then on to fellowship as well. And so you never know what might come up from these kinds of experiences. So, get experience, make sure you can perhaps get someone to vouch for you, preferably someone in the States, have good mentors. And that obviously extends beyond just people moving to the States. That's just, staying in medicine in general it's important to have good mentors to guide you through the process. And finally, like we mentioned before, there will be setbacks. It's not going to be a linear path to success, and there will be rejections. There will be difficult times, whether it comes to missing family, friends, whether it comes to the visa process. It's not going to be plain sailing, and I've got some very, very talented co-fellows who are having more issues with the visa process than I've had, and they're far more intelligent than I am, and it's a lot to do with luck as well, and so be prepared for that.
Yes, I mean, that's a lot of good points you make there. And finally, David, do you have any last points you want to make?
I would just echo exactly what Prashant and Shoaib just said. And I think it's about sort of being able to fit in. So, coming in and using completely different language than your American colleagues do won't make it any easier. And I certainly missed out on that, having not done, at least a recent observership, clerkship, or sub-I, as these guys did. I think, a lot of how you're judged as an intern in your first year is about how you function, not actually about your medical knowledge so much, but about how you sort of play the game and behave on rounds and keep on top of workflow. And I wish I'd known that beforehand, because it took me a long time to realize my own deficiencies in that area. Not that they're major and not that they carried forward with me at all, but I think it would be an easier transition if I was more familiar with the way residency functions from a service point of view. And the other thing I would say is, don't worry too much about the hours. I was really nervous knowing that I was going to have an 80-hour week, and my program director said, make sure you get loads of sleep before you start next week, when they emailed me, and I was really terrified about it. But what I would say, as long as you enjoy your job, as I do, which is why I decided to retrain from scratch, you really don't notice it that much. Yes, you might be a bit tired from working so many hours, but I think it's such a rich educational experience that that you don't really notice it so much after a while, and you just start to get into this new culture and enjoy being a part of that. So don't freak out just seeing that we have an 80-hour work week coming from the NHS background of 48 or whatever we're on nowadays.
I mean, there's a reason why you guys chose to stay there for even longer instead of coming back to the UK. You truly must enjoy the experience living out there, and also working for these, working for your hospitals / companies. So I just want to personally thank you for everyone for joining us today. And before we go away, Kim has actually put together a small little presentation about how to go to US, how to apply the entire, well, not the entire system, just a short presentation. So if anyone has any further questions, I do recommend to get in contact with one of the doctors who came here, and they can give you some tips for the future. So I'm going to pass my mic to Kim right now, where she'll do a presentation where she'll try and share screen.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay. So this is a very quick presentation, just about giving the steps to practicing in the USA. So I'll go through them step by step. These are the steps. So register as an international medical graduate, get your education verified, take your exams, apply for residency programs, Visas are kind of separate. And then also, depending on where you are, you need a state medical license. When I say depending on where you are, depending on what point in your training as well. So we know that US doesn't train enough doctors. They're saying they've got an estimated shortfall of about 125,000 by 2025. And at the moment, we're in the middle of a massive health crisis, and all of those problems are being illustrated and accentuated by the crisis that we're in. So people here are very open to international medical graduates. About 1 in 4 physicians practicing in the USA is an IMG, but it's not that easy getting to practice here. And there are a number of steps you have to jump through. And like my colleagues have been saying, you very much have to jump through the hoops that they put out for you, and put yourself, make sure that you do the things in a way that Americans are comfortable with. So one of the first things you have to do is go onto this website. So the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. This commission has a systematic process of evaluation and accreditation to ensure that we all pretty much have the same level of training, regardless of place of origin of training. It's not very difficult to do. You just go in, fill a few forms, put in your medical school. I think it costs about $125. And then once you get that, they give you, you can then apply to take the United States Medical Licensing Exam, which is the USMLE. So the USMLE, it's a national exam. There are 3 steps, but actually 4 steps. So step 1 is something that people often do in like 2nd or 3rd year of medical school. It's a 7-hour exam, questions out of 300. The pass score is 194, and the average score is about 212. But to do a cardiology fellowship like Prashant's, I think you probably need a score of more like 220. These scores in USMLE 1 were always used for people applying for residency, and the higher you scored, the more likely you were to get your place. But there's a big change. So the big change is that from next year, you're just going to get a pass or fail on step 1. And some people are happy about it and some people are not. You can read all about it on all the boards. The next is step 2, which is a clinical exam. It's a 9-hour exam. You can actually take the 2 together. They're not that dissimilar. Step 2 CS is an OSCE exam. It's only available in 5 cities. LA is one of the cities you can do it in. It's the one that I've actually done. It's pretty straightforward. I think I did pass it. I don't think I did as well in it because it was right when I came to America and I didn't have a lot of the language that people have here, which is slightly different. But I did pass it. And then step 3 is the final one that people take towards the end of residency. And again, it's 2 days of exam, 7 hours in a test session. On the first day, 9 hours on the second day. And these exams aren't like the exams we take in England. You know, in England, you take the RCOG membership exam twice a year. These exams you can take at any time of the year. You have to schedule them. So you pay for your certification, pay for each exam. And once you've got your certificate, they send you a permit and it gives you a time frame in order to do it. So it's normally you will sign up to do it within a 3-month time frame. They send you the permit for that time frame, and then you have to go onto a website called Prometric to actually schedule your test. And so you have this 3-month time frame. But at the moment, because I was going to do this in May, and then all the testing centers are shut, and you can see why they're shut. I don't think anyone in their right mind would want to sit in a place like this, particularly in Los Angeles at the moment, which is one of the places with the highest rates of SARS-CoV-2 infection in the US at the minute. We're on 600,000 cases. So all of the centers are shut because you can't sit and do your exam. So the exam is an online exam. You sit in this small booth, and you actually can have breaks between each section. So it's important just to know the steps of how you actually get there to do the exam. And now in California, once you start applying for residency, you have to also apply to the state medical board. Now the state medical board will also contact your medical school and verify your medical education. And this is one of the steps that I found a bit difficult because I discovered that the clerkships that I had to have in medical school, St. George's actually didn't give me quite the right number of hours in each section. So it's a very good idea to check with the medical board of the state that you're in, what they require from your medical school, and make sure that your medical school can actually accommodate that for you, because that can actually be a bit tricky. But this is actually pretty easy. You fill out the application online. They want your USMLE scores. You send them in, and they come back to you, and you get your license once you've done all of your exams. In New York and some of the on some of the East Coast, apparently you only have to register with the state medical board as you're leaving residency, but it's different in every state. So you've got your USMLE, you've started your application for the state medical board if you're in California. So what's the next step? As my colleague said, one of the interesting things about America, I always thought America was a meritocracy and that people were just simply judged on merit, but actually a lot of what we do in America is about is judged on people you know. And it is because, as my colleagues were saying, is that you're going into a residency program, you're going to be there for 4 years. They want to know you're going to stay the 4 years, you're going to be a good person to work with. And they're confronted with 700 applications of people who all look very, very similar. So if they have a letter of recommendation from someone they know, then it is really, really helpful. So going to conferences, networking with people in the area that you want to work in is really, really useful. Then it comes to your application. So applications generally start in August. You get a token from IRAS. You click on through this link here, and then match day is in March. And I think David probably knows better than me about problems with match day. And if you have any particular questions, he said that he's quite happy to answer those on Twitter if you have questions about match day. So everyone gets their jobs in March, and then jobs start in July. So there are in the UK, everyone starts on the first week of August. In the US, it's in July. It is different. So my colleagues have said 36-hour on calls, you get shorter training. There's no European time working directive, which some people may say is a good thing. Another thing that's quite important to remember, particularly if you're thinking of having children, is that you won't get the same kind of maternity leave that you get in the NHS. I have a colleague who's just had a baby, and she's basically got 3 months, and then she's back at work. So that's something that's very, very difficult, very, very different. The other tricky thing is getting a visa. So most doctors would come in on a J1 visa at the moment. The H visas, I think, have been suspended by the Trump administration. Green cards at the moment, it's very tricky to get a green card as well. I happen to have a slightly weird niche ability that got me an O1 visa. And if you can think that you have something that can fit into that, the way that you go about finding a visa is actually finding a immigration attorney and having them help you through the process. But my way into the US is I came in as a student. I came on a student visa, did a year, thought I liked it. Then you get a year working around the subject that you were studying in, which was quite useful. And then I transitioned into an O visa and then into a green card. So there are ways to come into the US if you don't think you're going to stay here forever, just to see what you think about it, to try it out. I mean, admittedly, being a student here at the moment is not really optimal because I'm teaching and all of our classes at the moment are on Zoom. So, and there have been difficulties with students getting back into the US if their teaching is not in person, but that is certainly one option to try it. So, sort of in summary, it's not easy, but I highly recommend it. There may be a hell of a lot of paperwork, and the green card application is quite lengthy. But if you like exams and you don't mind, a little bit of extra work, it can be really worthwhile. And if you don't want to do clinical work, there's teaching, there's medical research, there's pharmaceutical research, medical consultant. There are all kinds of different options that you can do rather than clinical practice if you feel like you just can't face another 9-hour exam. And it's really not that all bad. Living in another country, wherever you go, is a really, really good experience. The weather in the States isn't too bad. I can't really vouch for Vermont. I think they get a lot of snow there. But in California, it rains maybe for about 3 weeks total of the year, which I quite like. Not all of the hospitals here are for profit. There actually are plenty of really good places. There are a lot of people in the US who are crying out for good medical care, and you can actually come and make a huge difference to some very underserved populations. I mean, doctors don't really look like these guys, the ones that you see on Grey's Anatomy. But these guys are actually all as nice as all the doctors I ever worked with. But you will meet really interesting people. and people will constantly say to you, I love your accent, which happens to me all the time, or get very, very excited when I say aubergine rather than courgette, or dungarees rather than overalls, and look at me blankly when I ask for some water, but give me some when I say, can I have some water? But, you know, if you're up for it, if you're in it for the money as well, you can actually earn a huge amount of money here and make a very good living. So there are all kinds of different options. And I certainly would, even though there's some things about living here which I find very difficult, I still would say it was definitely the best thing that I ever did. And this is partly why, because I live 5 minutes from this beach and I get to walk on it most evenings. So if you're interested, you know, come and visit once once the borders are open again, and see what you think. I hope that was useful.
No, that was really useful overall. And I think something that I was personally confused prior to you doing the session was whether you can resit the exams. And I think a lot of people find that quite confusing. Could you resit the exams, and could you resit it to get a better score? So David, do you want to take this away?
My understanding, certainly, and I did mine a while ago, was no, you can't resit purely for a score. You could resit if you fail, but I believe that goes on your transcript, which gets released to programs. So it would be a black mark against you if you failed. Having said that, the scores for step 1, which is historically been the most important score to separate the pack, are being dropped as of next year. So it will become just a pass-fail exam. And so for people starting out now, it probably won't be quite as important. A lot of people are worried about that because it will limit your ability to distinguish yourself based on a parameter like that, which some people loved because it could be a way to compensate against something that is less competitive, like being an international medical graduate. For me, I went into those exams really not trying too hard, but just to pass them. And so I got respectable scores, but nothing good. And it didn't hold me back with the pathway that I took.
That's really interesting to know, because I think that's the case for a lot of people. They don't know what the situation like when you sit these exams. And I think something you brought up also with David, you also brought up was the fact that once you're on a visa, you only certain types of visa, you have working hour limits, which is good to know for anyone who's watching at home, who's considering about what sort of visa to get, and they should know about what they're signing up for. So I just want to thank everyone today for coming and volunteering the time to doing this session. I think we had some great conversations going on. I'll try my best one day to send you guys some tea from all the way here. I'm not sure about Prashant if you are going to be picky about your tea, but I'll try my best and pick a great selection for you.
I'll take Earl Grey, please.
Okay, Earl Grey, got that. I'm going to pass on the mic to Johan, who's going to just make the closing remarks.
Thank you to the whole panel for joining us and discussing this fascinating topic. It has been, I think, the whole world has a kind of love-hate relationship with the US, but you cannot help but being fascinated by what's going on in America most of the time. And having known several of our participants tonight for much of my clinical career, I've always been absolutely interested in what they're doing and hearing their stories. I wanted to personally thank Kim, Krista, Shoaib, David and Prashant, as well as Pedro, who hosted tonight, on behalf of the whole HLA community. We are incredibly grateful for you taking the time to join us and connecting back to your friends in Europe and the UK. HLA Live is thanks to the wider team, as well as Eamon, Riddy, Alistair, Adil, Tim, Pedro, and the rest for all their incredible work delivering the HLA Live program. We are incredibly lucky to have scholars that want to make a difference and a significant impact on healthcare across the globe, and use the HLA as a platform to bring their incredible ideas and innovations to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, do make sure you catch a future HLA Live episode, or join us at a HLA event, or apply for one of our programs, or apply to become a HLA scholar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Johan Marwana, and it's a good night from all of us.